Hello and welcome to another episode of It Came From the Page. And today, since September has officially brought in the start of the spooky season, I thought, hey, what better time to talk about some nonfiction books to read to get you in the mood for the spooky season. So I'm going to start off right away. So these will be my top 10, going from 10 to 1, as I always do. I'm always a countdown to my favorites or most important of the nonfiction books to me. A couple of caveats before we begin. I'm always reading new nonfiction books that are like spooky or creepy and that get me into the mood of the season. I haven't read them all, obviously, so there will be stuff that is going to be missing from this. Mainly Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Carol Clover. It's on my list to read this month. And in the season, and also Dance Macabre by Stephen King, which is the other big one that I haven't read. Also, I'm not mentioning Paperbacks from Hell on here. That one gets talked about all the time and is a great coffee table book. And I would recommend it, obviously, but I don't know. Everyone talks about it. I don't even think that Paperbacks from Hell would make the top 10 that I made, because there's a lot of stuff in here. So these are my nonfiction books. And they have a mixture of things that are personally important to me as a development as a kid, and also some that I just think is a flat recommend. Starting off at number 10 and already breaking all of my rules, this is a series of books, and if you grew up in a certain generation, you probably do know these books from your local libraries. The Crestwood House Monster Books. Now these are a series of kids books back in the day. They all have these amazing, like, bright yellow covers, cool looking spines, and they all focused on a very specific monster. And if you're interested in that monster, you take out the book, you read it, and it has a list of all of the movies that the monster has appeared in, a whole bunch of like old pictures from the movies that they've appeared in, and kind of goes through the entire history of whatever monster it is that you're picking up. Now, as a kid, I read these like every year, like nonstop. They were still at my local library, and that's how I kind of get a a connection to some really old school monster kids, because these books should probably have been put away and not at my library anymore, because they are old books and they had been well read, and I was one of the kids who was well reading them. And there is a lot of misinformation, right? This is not a series that is focused on accuracy. A lot of the books in this series did have things that were just not true, but they were all very fun to read and really great for kids, and really got me interested in monster movies as a kid and growing up, and introduced me to a lot of classic stuff that I would have never encountered before. And I got into these because I loved Godzilla, right? And there was a Godzilla book, and then there was also a King Kong book, but it also expanded to things like Dracula and Frankenstein, Creature from the Black Lagoon, all of these other creatures that I had just never encountered in my book reading life. And, you know, as a kid growing up in the 90s, no one talks about like the 30s and 40s movies of the Universal era, like, ever. So it introduced me to a lot of classics and really got me interested in the genre. So I don't know how well these would hold up to give to like a modern kid. I think that they would still be entertaining because they have such a flashy, bright colors on them and really do kind of bring you into the season. I don't actually own any of them anymore because, like I said, they were all at my local library. A lot of these are available digitally. People have archived these, and the ones that are online are like very expensive, so people are trying to charge through the roofs for these. Hopefully you just find it somewhere at a thrift store or something. I would recommend it, or just download the PDF and check it out for yourself, because these are very much fun to read. Especially if you're from a certain era. My number 9, going on to number 9, these are two books that I encountered at a thrift store ages ago. These have been reprinted, actually, but these are the official Splatter movie guides, book 1 and book 2, volume 1 and volume 2. These are both written by John McCarty, and these are fascinating to read from a historical standpoint, because a lot of the movies that we now consider classics were definitely not considered classics at the time. And a lot of where we are, I would say, critically on certain horror movies, they're very different than where they were back then. And I don't think any piece of reference material is better better explores that than these two books. They were written contemporarily at the time of the big 80s splatter booms. Let me see, when were these published? Yeah, these were originally the first volume was published in 1989, and then the second volume obviously after that. So they were kind of at the tail end of the 80s, talking about this trend of splatter movies. And we don't even really use the term splatter movies anymore. Like, that was a term that was kind of going about the critical analysis of a lot of old slasher movies and a lot of old 80s horror, and we don't even use those terms anymore, really. John McCarty actually patented the term splatter movies. He has an entire book that's all about the history of splatter movies as well. But these are just really fun to read. Also, like, fun to read if you're just looking for random stuff to watch. There is a boatload of books in that ilk where it's like people kind of going through and reviewing a bunch of movies. But I think that one is probably one of the best that I've encountered, for the sheer reason that you're able to get a kind of historical basis on all of these now classic movies and kind of figure out what did people think of at the time. And obviously, John McCarty is not speaking for the entire public and for everyone, but it is interesting to read somebody who's very invested in the genre talking about movies and reviewing very poorly some movies that I've never heard anyone say anything bad about. So for no other reason than reading some very interesting criticism from the time, they are definitely worth a read. And you will discover some interesting things that you never would have thought to watch. Number 8. This is a kind of a personal kind of biography told through the lens of horror. And this is by Adam Rockoff, who is a writer who will come up later on in this list, but this is a very fascinating and very fun look at what it was like to grow up as a horror fan back in that 80s era, where everything was kind of going mainstream, and like what it was like to kind of be there at the time to kind of get all of these now classic movies and enjoy what it was kind of like living in the 80s. I really like this book. I had a lot of fun reading it. Very, very readable. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this if you're somebody who likes to read kind of biographies that are kind of tinged through a horror lens. This one's obviously very, very focused on horror and really does kind of get into some very interesting parts of that particular era of growing up and what it was like. Spoiler alert. It wasn't like Stranger Things. Not really. Stranger Things does not really accurately describe what it was like growing up in that era. Especially when they show a full theater for like John Carpenter's The Thing, which was a famous flop at the time. But anyways, that's an entire digression of how Stranger Things is a bad way of looking at what the 80s was like. Anyways, now back onto the topic at hand. Number 7, this is any Linda S. Godfrey book. So Linda S. Godfrey is this researcher who will interview and will take in all these various cryptid sightings that people have done over the years. I specifically love her books I Know What I Saw, American Monsters, and Monsters Among Us. All three of those are really, really fun. And basically what they are is she will detail what a person said that they saw, and then she'll say, what was the scenario? Like, what was happening there? What are my theories about what it could have been? Could it have been a Bigfoot? Could it have been this? Could it have been this? And it's just all these very well-written, interesting, fun tales of various cryptid encounters. And whether or not you want to say that's fiction or nonfiction, that's up to you. I'm going to put it in here because they are filed under nonfiction. I am personally a skeptic, but I will never call anyone who said they saw a Bigfoot a liar. So these are not just Bigfoot encounters, though. Don't get me wrong. They're cryptids of all sorts and some of them are really, really quite creepy. And they're all really, really fun to just kind of put on. I would recommend these in audiobook form. I think those are probably the best ways to do Linda S. Godfrey books, because you can just kind of go around, go for a walk, and just listen to a bunch of creepy tales about people spying cryptids. Number 6. This is, again, of course, as we go on, you will see that this really isn't a list of a top 10. It's more of a list of like a top 20 if you count all the books. But It's top 10. This is Taking Shape, books 1 and 2 by Dustin McNeill and Travis Mullins, and also another book by Dustin McNeill called Slash of the Titans. So going back to Taking Shapes 1 and 2, those are all focused on the Halloween franchise, which is the Michael Myers Halloween. These are really, really fun books. Book 1 is detailing the behind-the-scenes information and the making-ofs of all of the movies up to that point. These do not get into the newest movies. There's a little bit of that, but they don't really get into like Halloween, the new one, and Halloween Kills. These are more focused on the original up to, of course, Halloween 2, the Rob Zombie movie, and goes through the entire making of all of these various sequels. And it's really well written, and I have a great time with it if you're a Halloween fan. But I would recommend Taking Shape Volume 2, even if you're not a fan of these movies. Because Taking Shape Volume 2 is detailing all of the unmade sequels. And I think that's super fascinating to read about what could have been in these various sequels. And reading all these different ways people tried to sequelize this very famous franchise. And that's the reason why Slash of the Titans is in here as well, because Slash of the Titans is all about the making of Freddy versus Jason. So it goes into all of the unmade scripts for that one. So really, Taking Shape 2 and Slash the Titans are great companion pieces because they all go into these unmade movies and really detail what could have been. And you will kind of go out of reading both these books with either an appreciation of the movies that we got, or you will have about 4 to 5 movies that you really wish had got made instead of some of your least favorites in whatever franchise it is. Number 5, this is Bleeding Skull, a 1980s trash horror odyssey. This is a fantastic book if you think you know it all, which I think everyone who's like a 1980s horror fan likes to think that they know it all, but the reality is there's always like 100 movies we haven't seen, and Bleeding Skull, an 1980s trash horror odyssey, will detail it all extensively. I haven't even finished this book, and I'm recommending it because there is that much good stuff in it. It is a smorgasbord of examining stuff that a lot of the times is this straight to VHS horror boom that nobody talks about because it's like impossible to detail. Well, the folks over at Bleeding Skull did it. There is a 1990s version as well, but I haven't got to that. But if it's of the same quality, I would recommend this wholeheartedly. There is so much stuff here that I'm like, wow, I have never even heard about any part of this movie, and I have been watching these movies for like 20 years. So I am very, very excited to dive into 80s stuff that I've never heard of. And obviously the 1990s will be a bunch of 90s stuff you never heard of. And it's all really, really well written and really funny too. Like there's a really good writing style in this particular book. And so I love what Bleeding Skull does as like a website. They worked with Vinegar Syndrome a lot. I think they're one of the partner labels, and they also work with AGFA, which is the American Film Genre Archive. American Genre Film Archive. Yeah, it's AGFA. It's let's just look up AGFA, and that's them. So they actually have done re-releases of certain movies that were from this collection. So I really, really love this collection of books and stories and movies and a whole bunch of stuff you've never seen. And it's always good when you are entering spooky season to get some cool movies that you have never, ever seen. Number 4. In Search of Frankenstein. In Search of Frankenstein by Radu Florescu. Radu Florescu wrote a few other books that we'll kind of get into a little bit later. But In Search of Frankenstein gets its own thing because it is the only book I have on here that is all about the creation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This goes into the cultural legacy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the creation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and all of these really, really wonderful, exquisitely written details about our favorite Frankenstein, Dr. and monster. So I absolutely love this book. I had a wonderful time reading this, and I would really recommend anyone who is into the books, into the movies, into anything to pick this up and just kind of explore and imagine what it would have been like living the life of Mary Shelley on that amazing summer when she invented science fiction and also a horror icon. So this is an absolute recommend. I had a tremendous time reading it. I don't agree with all of the things that the book says. Like, there's some conclusions that Radu Florescu draws that I don't necessarily agree with, but just the way that it kind of engrosses you in Shelley's life and Shelley's story is exquisite and a super, super high recommend from me. Number 3 is another set of 2 books, and that is Going to Pieces by Adam Grockoff, who also wrote The Horror of It All, and also the Slasher book by J.A. Kurzweil. Both of these books are all about the history of slasher movies and how they got started, what it was like to kind of be there during the time period, and how everything kind of evolved as the subgenre moved forward. What started it? What were the influences? How was it received culturally? Just a history of slasher movies in general. This book, I actually finished this book yesterday, and that actually inspired me to do this list, has some amazing spreadsheets and pictures to go along with all of the wonderful information in the book. I got this from the library. I own Going to Pieces digitally, and that was a great read as well. So if you're interested in the history of slasher movies, I would recommend both books. Going to Pieces is more focused on just like the history of it. It's not as flashy with the photographs and everything like that, and it's told from a very American perspective, whereas the Slasher book by J.A. Kurzweil, which has some wonderful photos in it, also has a more British viewpoint, I would say, as I believe Kurzweil grew up in Britain. Or if he didn't, he just wrote a lot more about the British perspective on the slasher boom than anyone else has. So I think these two work great together, and Kurzweil's is the one that's like very, very pretty and fun to read, and Going to Pieces is probably a little bit more, I would say, a little bit more academic, but I think they both really do work well as a pair. So I really recommend both of them. Number 2 is a huge cheat, and that's what we call Dracula books. So, In Search of Dracula by Raymond T. McNally and Radu Florescu, A Dream of Dracula by Leonard Woolf, and honestly my favorite, which is A Night in Transylvania, the Dracula Strap book by Kurt Brokaw. I included the other two because these are both really good reads. I would say this is an amazing academic dissection of Dracula and just the general output of what Dracula meant to pop culture. And then there's a lot of very personal writing here by Leonard Woolf, and a lot of stuff in here that I just found fascinating, right? Like, this is a really, really well-written book that is very personal and also explores areas of the vampire phenomenon that we don't really get in too much in these other books that I'm talking about. So this is a very unique book and very interesting and very important to read. I would recommend Leonard Woolf's A Dream of Dracula for sure. In Search of Dracula is a very important book culturally, and it is kind of the book that's the reason why people connect the historical Dracula and the Bram Stoker's Dracula together in more recent years, because it actually did the effort to kind of go through and explore the actual history of what Dracula meant to people. Like, who was Vlad Dracul, and why was he called the Impaler? What is the actual history of the character that we all know in pop culture as Dracula? So Bram Stoker did very minimal research on Dracula. Like, I think he just got the name and stuck it on his character, and Bram Stoker's Dracula is not the historical Dracula. He is very, very limited exposure to the history of Dracula, and that's because no one really had done a huge historical deep dive on Dracula until this book. So In Search of Dracula is a very important book to read if you are interested in the study of vampires and, of course, the historical Dracula. So there's a lot of really cool history tidbits in here, and great book, a very important book, a very influential book. And if you're one of those people who are like, why are the historical Dracula and my Bram Stoker Dracula mixed? You can blame this book when it came out in the 70s and was a big hit. So, In Search of Frankenstein is like the sequel to In Search of Dracula, but I wanted to give that book its own thing there. So, and this is my favorite. This is the one that's probably the least culturally important and definitely not as, historically important as the other one, but it is just a very, very fun book. So this book really details this like travel log to all of these various places in Transylvania. Also has some movie posters and pictures as well, and deals with some of the history of vampires as well. But I really just loved the experience of just living through this guy's journey into Transylvania to look at all of these historical pieces. And it was outstanding. Like, I love this book. I read it super quick. I just wanted to live in the world of this book. And it's like the book starts out where he goes to this, before he heads out to Transylvania, he stops in New York to eat at the Dracula restaurant. The Dracula restaurant no longer exists, but it was very fun to kind of imagine what was that like. And then he gets on this plane and then goes visits all these like historical things. And it was amazing. So this is probably my favorite of the bunch. And this one's just like a fun book to read. So not as culturally or historically important, but like a very fun Dracula travel log, essentially. And my number one is Scary Movies by A.S. Mott. I doubt you've heard about this book. This book is probably not talked about too much, for probably a good reason. It's not the best book ever written about the genre, but for me, it's the most important book ever written about the genre. I used to be terrified of horror movies. They used to be the thing that scared me more than anything else. So I got over my fear by picking up this book and learning how they were made, and to appreciate what these movies were exploring, why they were exploring them, what was the importance of horror cinematically, how it wasn't made, how it's like, oh, this is you dealing with horror stuff, but in a safe environment. And I still love this book today. I still think it's an important book to my own kind of cultural life. And I really do love this book. And it does actually have some pretty good behind the scenes about some of these movies, and also features a lot of recommendations. So I really kind of helped to kickstart my know-how and my interest in horror cinema and horror in general. So that's why it's on here. What are your favorite horror books that fall into nonfiction? I would love to hear. Please let me know in the comments below, and I hope you guys have a great day.